Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our last SAFPAC seminar of this academic year. I'm very pleased to we have Manu Bazzano, who's honorary fellow of SAFPAC, to come and talk about psychotherapy as subversive art. Manu's done all sorts of things, but particularly his latest book is Subversion and Desire, Pathways to Transindividuation. Perhaps we might just hear some more of it today. Yeah? There it is. Manu, over to you.
Thank you, Dale, for inviting me, and thank everyone for showing up. I would have preferred to be in Wimbledon in person, but today I couldn't. So, psychotherapy is an art. For many of us, I count myself among these, this claim has considerable appeal. And this may be true even when, in deference to the scientism currently fashionable, some practitioners select a rather contrite version of the above statement, psychotherapy is an art, and they describe it as a science of the arts. I'm thinking of Alan Shaw, for example, a neuropsychoanalyst. My intention here is not to defend the claims that it's an art, but to see how far it can go. To vaguely endorse it feels apologetic. It also implies a facile polarization between art and science, between a usually preferred subjective, qualitative dimension and a seemingly objective and quantitative domain. Besides, it would be wrong to bring art into the equation without some appreciation of the aesthetic experience. In relation to therapy, this requires developing a better grasp of the craft of therapy, of its imaginative response to the sheer elusiveness of mental distress. Appreciating our practice as a craft already frustrates, to some degree, the neoliberal robotic takeover to which most therapeutic orientations comply. But something more than this is needed, pervasive re-envisioning of how we understand the craft of therapy and how it may relate to art and aesthetics. A good place to start when aligning therapy with the domain of art is the notion of world feeling. This is the first point I want to make. World feeling, articulated by Adorno in his lecture on aesthetics. The prompt of using Adorno emerged in part from sporadic but meaningful conversation I had with existential therapist Richard, to whose memory this talk is dedicated. Richard was keen to explore parallels and discrepancies between Adorno and Sartre. And we both found in the writings of the Frankfurt School useful pointers for a healthy critique of therapy in general, and in particular, conventional, traditional, Husserlian existential therapy. This is an ambitious task, even when, if you consider that in England, at least in England where I live, there was no Frankfurt School, there has been no Sartre, has been no Lefebvre, has been no Gramsci, no Della Volpe, as Perry Anderson pointed out recently. And so the task is even more difficult because of that, particularly in the UK. It might be a different story with people who are present tonight and are from other countries. So the way I will proceed is to draft a handful of points encouraged by Adorno's lectures and writing on aesthetics, and then see how far this can help or not the task of therapy. The assumption here is that something might be gained from outlining parallels between the aesthetic response, say, to a work of art, to a painting, and the therapeutic response to the material presented in the clinic. The focus here of therapy as art comes to mean an imaginative, aesthetic rejoinder to not the person or the client, but to the emergent phenomenon, the matter at hand, including, perhaps especially, when the matter at hand, the material in the clinic, appears to be a breakaway, a drift that challenges the subject's, the person's pretension to mastery. I have this problem, can you please solve it? Instead, the problem would be the departing point from this ossified notion of self. So far, so generic. How can therapy become subversive? Already by shifting the focus on the emergent phenomenon rather than the self of the client. The emergent phenomenon as an important moment of departure and deterritorialization. This is not as clear-cut as it might sound, and it could well mean what Yulia Kristeva calls turning a crisis into a work in progress, rather than fixing the crisis the client presents, turning it into an opening, into a work in progress. The ambivalent but essential process of interpretation never lets us forget that whatever Apollonian wisdom or insight there might be in our strange craft, it is born only in proximity with Dionysian madness. A useful reminder in times of Philistine pragmatism and overzealous sanitization of how forever entangled the wound is to the healing and the interpreter to the dreamer. In more plain language, we're always a step away from madness, both client and therapist. And the fact that we are might be good news in terms of the potential for psychical transformation as opposed to mere cosmetic change, in which that doesn't interest me in the least. And I find very boring, a simple change to adjust and adapt to a already essentially mad society. So in this perspective, the subject, the me, the self of the client is decentered in favor of experience and psyche. That after all, the name of our strange craft is psychotherapy, is not ego therapy. It is, and when you think of it, it is what humanistic practitioners call the self-construct, The self-construct emerges from the wider domain of the experiential and psychical field. Is not the other way around. I don't have an experience. Experience is the wider domain out of which the changing construct of me arises. And then the meeting of the two, experience and the self, we have learned from Merleau-Ponty, is none other than perception. And that's where the real psychotherapy work happens. Let's go back to the parallel with the work of art. Adorno tells us a subjective response to a work of art, say a painting, is neither determinate, clear-cut, is not unambiguous, and it's not designed to formulate clear-cut intellectual judgments. A finely attuned aesthetic response. For example, Adorno mentions the paintings of Manet, apprehends both the pleasing harmony of colors as well as the rupture constituted by the extreme contrasts of color. Same example, also favored by Adorno, is the simultaneity in music of dissonance and consonance, with the predominance of the dissonant element, prompting the listener in some cases to reconsider assumptions and value judgments about what constitutes beauty and ugliness. I have been a musician, the sort of a rock music type of thing, for quite a long time. I suspended, I am coming back to it. And I remember one session where I asked a keyboard player, very talented keyboard player, to simply stay on the same note while the rest of the band would go to different notes. It was, but it's dissonant. That's the point. It is the point of dissonance. And he was more schooled in harmonic type of music or pop music. For example, to give you an example, a band that really despised, ABBA. And there was a funny moment while I am receiving radiotherapy at the moment for cancer. And I was lying on this thing, which looks pretty much like a casket, being zapped. And they put ABBA, that part that says, having the time of your life, etc. I say, yeah, right. Close brackets. The work of art, Adorno says, paraphrasing Hegel, does not offer a slogan, but takes in instead the contradictions of the world and of human experience. More to the point, and in a way that is reminiscent of Derrida's discussion of Plato's pharmacon, Adorno reminds us that cognition, understood here in the broader sense as knowledge, both wounds and heals. The allusion he applies here is from the ancient Greeks. Prosas iasetai, he who wounds also heals. A source worth noting, as it offers a distinctive variation on the Jungian tired trope of the wounded healer. The example here comes from a different story. Telephus, son of Heracles, and a popular tragic hero, was wounded by Achilles' spear. The only thing that will heal his wound is that very same spear. There's an engraved Etruscan bronze mirror from the second half of the 4th century BC, and another work of art from around the 1st century BC. They both show Achilles healing Telephus with the rust from his spear. What created the wound will heal it. For Adorno, receptivity to the work of art creates rupture. And it is at the core of this rupture that healing and transformation are to be found. Adorno calls, as I mentioned before, this receptivity to art, to the wound and healing, world feeling, which is completely different from the traditional existential notion of worldview. And in fact, unlike hermeneutics, world feeling is for Adorno capable of holding the intrinsic contradictions found in the work of art. This is, just to make it clear, an anti-hermeneutic. For Adorno, the hermeneutic interpretative stance, quote, destroys the whole interwovenness of truth and untruth, the interwovenness of what is alive. What is required instead is to perceive and withstand the alive contradiction and opposition present in the world. A stance that is more valid than an ideological pursuit of so-called truth, and a capitalized truth at that. In other words, we go to art as we go to poetry, not for wisdom, but for the dismantling of wisdom. Similarly, we go to psyche or psyche, not in search of certainty and corrective answers, but for greater learning and deeper appreciation of the aliveness and dialectical ambivalence inherent to existence and immanent in the therapeutic encounter. So a first hypothesis then could be that to think of therapy as an art and to practice therapy as an art would mean adopting a counter or anti-hermeneutic stance in favor of a more nuanced outlook. In Adorno's own writings, the cultivation of this outlook goes parallel to his critique of Husserlian subjectivity with its attendant drive to identity, even to pure identity, an entity which, as one would expect in a philosophy of origins, such as phenomenology, remains blissfully undisturbed throughout the hermeneutic investigation. The self, the subject, which is, the actual cause of the problem, remains untouched by the investigation. What good is it, an investigation that leaves the self untouched, and if anything, bolster it? One example of a positional or ideologically interpretative response to art is what Adorno calls, quote, vulgar existentialist interpretations of Kafka. There is such a thing, and end quote. There is such a thing as vulgar existentialism, he goes on to say, guilty not only of passing in imbecilic oversimplification, but also regaling us, he says, with an atrocious word, which is now all the rage in conventional existential therapy. I'm thinking of Professor Spinelli, for example. Worldview, a term which has gained some currency now. For Adorno, world feeling must replace worldview. Applied to therapy, world feeling becomes Ariadne's thread, leading us out of our baffled wanderings within the hermeneutics maze. It can lead us out of the prison house of so-called being, out of the embroglios of a circuitous, self-referential, Cartesian, Husserlian subject, and its attendant bourgeois relational yearnings and conjectures. It can lead us out of the highway to a side road, then to a path, fading out to everywhere. Replacing worldview with world feeling means not succumbing to the sloganeering and the foreclosed conclusions and judgments often typical of a phenomenological inquiry, which is often a treasure hunt for being. Very often, existential phenomenology is simply a prelude, almost like a smokescreen for the real work, the unveiling of so-called, of an abstraction, so-called being. If we avoid that trap, a vista, open up to the ambivalent entwining, allowing the work of art to incorporate the wealth of the existing. The world feeling is internally articulated as well as historical. In Kafka's novel, it has less to do with the so-called human condition, a feeling of our own God-forsaken, thrown, fear-distorted existence. Instead, it is a thoroughly modern feeling that in its own way critiques and reproduces the world, finding, quote, in Adorno, a synthesis as well as a formal law, L-O-W, L-A-W. Crucially, this law is not external, this is important, it's not external to the material. Poetry, music, the novel, the emergent phenomenon in therapy, but is thoroughly immanent. A point also made by Benedetto Croce, as well as Walter Benjamin. The aesthetic response is here motivated by a desire to remain near the matter at hand to the point of disappearance. The therapist has to disappear into the material because what is being investigated is no longer the self of the client. Plus, important to say, this intimacy has nothing to do with merging with the other, that persistent shadow in psychotherapy's current fascination with the relational, the intersubjective, but instead, the intimacy is with the emergent phenomena. We enter into the emergent phenomena, the material. Famous Zen story, I'm just suddenly reminded. The king or the emperor rather, Japan invites the Zen teacher, who was also a painter, to do a fresco, a beautiful fresco. It takes a long time. Finally, the painting is made, and it's a beautiful landscape with a path. The emperor asks, where does it lead, the path? And the painter says, I have no idea. Let's have a look. And they both enter the painting and vanish. They never came back from the painting. And this is a similar thing. To disappear, to get lost, completely lost into the emergent phenomena that the client is presenting. This kind of intimacy is also not only anti-hermeneutics, it's also counter anti-epistemological, not in the sense of not knowing, which is now fashionable, and others. They should start a professorship in not knowing. I'm sure somebody is working on that as we speak in some university department. So it's not knowing, but more an inquisitive gaze on knowledge as fetish, knowledge as instrument of control. And I'm sure people say, well, what are you doing? Aren't you expounding knowledge? Yes, and I'm also trying to undo it and cross it out as I go along, as David Bowie's album, Heaven, Hidden, Pagan, Hidden. Every lyric is crossed out. That's what I'm talking about. If anything, this move positively gestures towards a kind of knowing that is close to Anerkennung, Hegel's notion of recognition, acknowledgement. The fashionable stance of not knowing, be it Socratic, humanistic, existential, simply will not do. Not knowers protest too much, methinks. Their championing of not knowing tends to overestimate the know-how that may just about succeed in controlling events, measuring experience, and appeasing anxiety. What gets forgotten is that knowledge is important, in fact, but a different type of knowledge, as Rosie Riss was keen of reminding me when I did my doctorate and assisted by her and by O'Neill. Knowledge is important, but it's a knowledge that it comes out of intimacy with the material rather than fear. Adorno would say that the will to knowledge is born out of fear. And here we're talking about a different knowledge. Of course, knowledge is important. The stories we tell, the stories traversing the consulting room are imbued with a more or less conscious pursuit of knowledge. Narration, from the Latin narus, getting to know, is knowledge, getting closer with a matter at hand. But the other type of knowledge, okay, let me go back to Adorno. The person who knows about art is, for Adorno, like a native who knows his way around the city, has an intimate closeness with the city. It's only the dilettante or the tourist of psychotherapy who goes around, the tourist would say, how beautiful, how beautiful, how amazing, how beautiful. That's the dilettante approach. When I am close to the emergent phenomenon, I am less likely to be sidetracked by suggestive interpersonal evocations, be they I thou, relational depth, intersubjectivity, or the usual evocation of stale mommy daddy scenarios just beyond the stage curtain. I do think that there is some hope, after all, in phenomenological existential inquiry, despite my inbuilt pessimism on the matter, despite the Heideggerian deviations, which have nearly neutered the impact of this approach. But it is a matter of finding the right antidote, something which Adorno, with a little help from Hegel, gives us plenty. Genuine and aesthetic enthusiasm fulfills both the superficial, hypersubjective awe and dissipates it. So at one point, it makes us, it captures our attention. It's a study of the self, you could say. But at the same time, as the Zen tradition would say, to study the self is to dissipate, to forget the self. Likewise, in therapy, genuine enthusiasm for the emergent phenomenon dissolves excessive fascination with the self. For Hegel, I quote, artistic enthusiasm entails none other than being completely filled with the matter, being entirely present in the matter, and not resting until the matter has been stamped and polished into artistic shape. This is aligned also with the notion of a good psychoanalytic practice, where interpretation comes and waits and waits and waits in the wing until it simply emerges from the material itself, rather than from the demiurge, the magician, psychoanalyst who will find the magic interpretation. And it's also similar, incidentally, to Benjamin's way of doing research, gathering, and then trusting that matter will begin to take a shape by itself, will begin to take build its own momentum. This kind of experience, world feeling, or in this case, aesthetic enthusiasm, let's call it. But let's stay with the world feeling, is even more valuable because it does not bow to either generic ideational content or the sanctified meaning which traditional therapists routinely adopt and impose on an allegedly inert existence. What I'm saying is it's not about the clarification of ideational content. It's also not about meaning, because meaning presupposes that the matter at hand is inert, that we need to impose a meaning to experience. Whereas Merleau-Ponty would tell us the meaning is already inherent in, say, Cézanne's picture. We don't need to impose it from the outside. In following this, we would be outside the self-bound epistemological principles and the principle of actions outlined by Dilthey, the foundation, which constitute the foundation by and large of Husserl's phenomenological project, which remains to this day influential and existential, and I would say in most therapies, even if it is still operating behind the scene. Why do I say this? Let's have a very quick look at Dilthey. For Dilthey, what is there for us can only connect with consciousness through the inner apprehensions of psychic events and activity. These constitute, quote, a special realm of experiences which has its independent origin and its own material in inner experience, and which is accordingly the subject matter of a special science of experience. Closely relying on Immanuel Kant, Dilthey sees the special realm of inner experience not only separate from external perceptible objects, but as the very condition. So the inner world, the inner perception, the mental, psychic realm, let's call it, is a very condition of possibility of objects of experience. And this will reach its sort of apotheosis, comical apotheosis in Melanie Klein, where you begin to wonder whether other people truly exist or are simply introjects. They are simply parts of my own phantasmagoria of this inner life. This is, for Adorno, run-of-the-mill psychology. He refers to Dilthey and to Husserl. And it works with concepts such as objective type, subjective type, without touching the driving force, without touching the dark foundation. Now, admittedly, psychoanalysis in its history has not shied away from exploring these dark materials. Whether or not it succeeded is another question. But for Adorno, it was certainly better, deeper, and less conformist than the kind of psychology used by the Husserlian school. This was a while ago he said that. But now the reality is that psychoanalysis too has demonstrated suffering from what I call the prejudice of the inner life, what Benjamin would call the phantasmagorias of the interior, the prejudice of inner experience. Psychoanalysis too suffers from giving ascendancy to the subject, be it the artist, the viewer, reader, or the patient, the client, at the expense of the matter at hand. Example, it is a mistake. This is what I'm talking about is a mistake, as we tend to do nowadays, to apply any work of art to the psychology of the artist. And then, not to say of the moralizing work, the artist has to be a moral hero, otherwise the art would be looked down upon. So in that sense, having neglected the emergent phenomena, current psychodynamic, psychoanalytic work did not fulfill its promise. It has become another form of psychology, inescapably moored, like existential therapy, to the primeval fiction in neurosis, the subject. And to the subject, primary and static theater, the family. We're back to me, and my mom and dad. Excessive focus on the subject means disregarding the work of art, forgetting psyche, neglecting or sanitizing, fumigating, I would say, the unconscious, and effectively ignoring the phenomenal field of experience. The work itself goes beyond psychology. It is something more than psychology. And if we look at the aesthetic experience, an aesthetic experience, and I've been interested in, incidentally, because I'm aware that there are artists today, as well as therapists with us, so I've been interested in that take on this. An aesthetic experience which understands the work of art as a mere symptom, it's a thumbprint of the artist, psychological characteristic, is merely pre-artistic. Similarly, ascribing emergent phenomena coming up in the clinic to the client patient is subjectivistic. It falls short of properly addressing psyche. The work of art, in other words, does not belong to the artist. Psyche does not belong to the person. It does not belong to the client, the patient. It does not belong to the therapist or analyst. I remember James Hillman was fond of saying, we are both patients. We are both patients of psyche, both client and therapist. 1.5 centuries of bourgeois psychology made us forget this simple truth. And the more objectified and concretized bourgeois society is, the more it insists that the works of art springs purely from the subject, from the person. The more stultified society becomes under a current regime of an aggressive regime, I would argue, of neoliberalism, the more it will assert the psychical experience is a mere attribute subject. It will also insist that whenever psychical experience appears to exceed our self-bound consciousness, it must be pathologized. And to use a fashionable term, regulate. I have mentioned in passing neoliberalism, and I just want to take a very, very short detour, mentioning a book that has just come out in French, in France, not yet translated. Pierre Dardot, philosopher, and Christian Barvar, sociologist, taking the cue from Foucault. They wrote a book called Le choix de la guerre civile, une haute histoire néolibéralisme. So the choice of civil war, another history of neoliberalism. So when I suggest psychotherapy could be an art and then a subversive art, so art, I hope I have more or less, however confusedly, outlined what an art would mean. Subversive would mean getting out as fast as we can from the clutches of neoliberalism. What is neoliberalism? In the early days of neoliberalism, it was understood that it was a form of voluntary servitude. You know, with postmodernism, everybody is working in a very subdued, docile, everybody trying to making living, you know, Dell would call it in the therapeutic world, everybody's involved in our cottage industry, psychotherapy. So it's sort of benign brainwashing neoliberalism that in fact makes us, all of us, into willing subjects, willing, subjects of this particular mode of existence. And what is neoliberalism? Is a mode that transforms every single living thing into a commodity. But now these two writers, Dardot and Laval, suggest that the new form of neoliberalism is in fact a form of, they call it a form of social war, with an onslaught that we see at the moment against trade unionism, against workers' collective bargaining power. And they're also looking at the history of neoliberalism. The people usually quote Hayek and they quote Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. Those are grim examples, grim enough. But they forget another figure who was key in the promotion of neoliberalism, Augusto Pinochet, the war criminal and in Chile, and who through the golpe destroyed the democratic government at the time. So the argument this researcher proposed is that when you look closely, the more compliant form of neoliberalism has now become an aggressive form. An aim to check if you're interested in this kind of discourse is Jessica White, who published The Morals of Neoliberalism, and discusses in many interesting ways the forms of neoliberalism, including its fatalism, the belief in market fatalism, the belief that the market is immune to human action. And then discourse that criticizes then Islam, for example, or socialist thinking as fatalist. There is more to this, but I mention it because we are up against very aggressive and coercive force of neoliberalism, and it will not be easy to get away from the clutches of the ideological influence. Also, given that a close scrutiny, one could argue, therapy has become one of the ideological transmission belts of neoliberal thinking. You know, you have a problem, you have a problem which is societal, political, contextual, and you go to a therapist and the problem will be atomized and addressed as your own individual problem. That's the essence of neoliberal thinking. And I'll stop there. I just wanted to add this few notes. So given what we are up against, is there any hope for therapy? Given that hope is the greatest of evils, Nietzsche would teach us, ejected onto the world by Pandora when she opened that box, could a radical, Richard Pierce would call it a radical therapy, or could a counter-traditional therapy, could a counter-existential therapy be possible ever? Is there anything within the existential phenomenological tradition, within the humanistic tradition, within the psychoanalytic and psychodynamic tradition that neither substantiates the self, the subject, nor bypasses the subject, but instead emancipates it? Richard Pierce's answer would have been a decisive yes. And his resounding affirmation is the reason why there is hope, why it may be possible to develop the basis for what Richard Pierce called radical psychotherapy. For him, the first crucial step is, and I quote him, to maintain an awareness of the radical foundations of our work. For him, the life and work of Jean-Paul Sartre, his ingenious critique and consistent praxis, his weaving of existential theory with a strong ethical political commitment, constitute the very essence of those radical foundations. In relation to the dilemma of the self-construct in particular, the existential tradition has adeptly confirmed the impossible goal of self-knowledge that we are constantly striving for, a goal only realizable in death. This project is compatible with critical theory, not only with the general tenets of the early days of the Frankfurt School, but also with some of its contemporary manifestations. Think of Judith Butler. Think of Bernard Harcourt, who are people who understand with Nietzsche the critical task as creating a radical theory of illusions, a project of seeing through the illusions and ideologies. The two terms are interchangeable of our age. Tommy Shelby provides a rather neat definition of illusion, a widely held set of associated beliefs and implicit judgments that misrepresent significant social realities and that functions through this distortion to bring about or perpetuate unjust social relations. A radical theory of illusions coincides with the hermeneutics of suspicion, constituting for Merleau-Ponty the very foundation of existential phenomenology. So you see, I am stating something contradictory. We have lost, because we have lost this link of phenomenology, existential phenomenology, to a hermeneutic of suspicion, because we have lost the link to Nietzsche, Marx, and Freud, who are the masters of suspicion. Existential phenomenology has become, alongside psychodynamic therapy and theory, another form of psychology. For that reason, it is distressing to me to realize how little and how reductively Merleau-Pontian phenomenology and its sympathetically dialectical relationship with Sartre's philosophical project has impacted traditional therapy, particularly existential therapy, which relies too heavily, in my view, on Husserlian and Heideggerian interpretations. For Adorno, these are not compatible with a critical project. Because why? Because Husserl assumes the existence of a Cartesian subject who inertly perceives an objective reality. Whereas with his notion of Dasein, Heidegger destabilizes the very premises within which a critical subject can be construed. Adorno's critique goes much further, especially in relation to Heidegger. For him, there is very little difference between the elevation of existence in being and time and Kierkegaard's notion of consciousness, what he calls the transparency of the subject in Sickness Unto Death. And I will skip this part because I won't have a chance to have it, to hear from people.
Manu, are you saying to open this up now?
I wonder whether I said anything. I think I'll stop it now. I stop it in suspended there. There is a lot more, but yeah, I hope to. In fact, hopefully there will be a paper of this, and people can read the extended version, and also, of course, some of the material is in the book. So thank you for listening. Thank you for your patience, your attention.
Well, thank you, Manu. So let's see what emerges now. Yeah. So we open it up to questions, to comments. Both people in the room and, of course, people on the internet as well. Just put your mic on, obviously, when you speak.
Manu, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
I really like thinking about phenomena emerging in the room. Something I was thinking about a while ago, which you just brought back to my mind. It's kind of in this context between a therapist and a client. Who might the midwife be in the birthing of it, as it were, and whether it's possible for like a kind of co-authorship, a kind of co-birthing on a purely equal level between the client and the therapist, you know, whether it's possible that we're both overseeing the delivery on an equal from an equal footing, or whether we have a bit more of a, in the same sense as a mother who's about to give birth or going to a hospital seeking the help of a midwife for that delivery, whether there's a kind of an expert stance that we cannot get away from, a bit like a midwife, if you see what I mean. Maybe I'll just leave it there and see what you have to, you know, think about that.
So it's an excellent point. I would say definitely and hopefully, and democratization of the therapeutic encounter. And I would say even more, we could say if we move away from the principle or whatever guiding principle be in therapy, if we move away from arche and we go for an anarchist form of therapy, then the chances are there more for this sort of possibility of an equal encounter. The difficulty is that the frame, one-to-one, the therapy room, the higher space, the entire thing is already puts us in the wrong footing. So our task would be to reverse it. And one way, I like the way you put it beautifully, is to try to equalize as much as possible. So thank you for that.
Yeah. So you're saying that maybe it's a matter of just being mindful then of maybe this, so for example, the space that the encounter takes place in, and thinking about equalizing it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, not as a, you know, it's a very subtle thing, but it's already equalized. It's a shift. Well, well, let me put it another way. Equalization is impossible because of the very nature of the therapeutic space. But we can subvert our own role. And one way of subverting is to pay attention and be responsive to and learning from the emergent phenomenon and to get lost in that. So, yeah, I would say, you know, democratization, yeah, I would say it's an effort, as in any other endeavor. I'm thinking of Derrida, hospitality. It's impossible, but we have to strive for it.
If psychotherapy is the art, then who's the lead songwriter or the primary painter? You know, we have to try and make it the client, I think, is what you're saying.
I'm not sure. I don't really know what I'm saying. It's all work in progress. But I'm basically tired and fed up with where psychotherapy is going, and I might go back to cooking for all I'm concerned. But you know, before I do that, I would like to think about it, and can we make it in a different way? But anyway, yeah, work in progress.
Manu, always when you talk, there's always so much that's really interesting and something that needs to be engaged with. But
Thank you.
One of the things I find myself thinking about is fear, and I think that story, that Zen story, is a great story about the emperor and the painter getting on the path and getting lost. So I guess I'm thinking about the fear of getting lost, or or the fear of being overwhelmed by the phenomenon. And I suppose I think that what you said about intimacy, and that how it's basically, you're saying knowledge is important, and when it comes to intimacy rather than fear. And I find myself wondering about the fear that's involved in intimacy in a way, and I wonder about how those two things go together. That's what I find myself thinking about.
Indeed, the fear is there, and the fear is hard to avoid. And also, particularly at the time when I feel the whole profession is enveloped by fear. It's basically, the thing is, let's make sure nothing happens during the therapy hour. Because if something happens, boy, where will I be? But I think the antidote would be what Adorno calls aesthetic enthusiasm. And I don't know what to call it, but the absorption in the material itself. And that, the material itself can be overwhelming in a way that is refreshing, and that it makes me stop and think, maybe there is something to this stupid business of therapy. And it has to do with this, my God, where that come from, where that particular, I could give you several examples of clinical practice, but I said the fear is inevitable, and the fear is sometimes also a warning, which maybe we should listen to. At the same time, when the, what I call the emergent phenomenon really is there, clear, crystal clear in the room, I like to think the fear somehow takes second stage. And the enthusiasm, the excitement of this new emergent phenomenon is such that can perhaps diffuse at least the fear. I think the best examples I found is in Kristeva, in Tales of Love. She would mention it would be wrong to see John or Jane's erotic wanderings outside the marital bed as something to be fixed. The thing is to walk along in those meanderings and see what emerges. So one other step would be to see the emergent phenomenon, to see the problem that the client presents as personified, as a new aspect of the self that is emerging. And it's so exciting. And for a moment, we might forgive our ever-present fear as practitioners.
Hi everyone.
I was going to.
Sorry. Yeah. Thanks. So I wanted to ask Manu. Yeah, I'm here. So how much do you think that these problems that you are presenting in psychotherapy, how much do you think it's related to the professionalization of this work? Because I feel that because it's become formalized and there are protocols and there are textbooks, like official guidebooks and guidelines and official curricula that they teach. And so how much do you think that this has to do with this problem of becoming like this ideological form? Or does it make sense?
Completely. I think it has a lot to do with professionalization, a lot to do with having turned into a cottage industry, and totally. And with appeasing the powers, if you look at I don't know in Hungary, but if you look at the UK, I would say claims, the majority of the professional bodies are there to appease state and government. And they don't care a hoot about the single practitioner or the collectivity of the profession. All they care is this abstract notion of the public, whatever that is. But also, first of all, to appease the government, appease the power. It may be less true of UKCP, but look at BACP, my goodness. What's going on there? Anyway, yes, absolutely, yes, 100% spot on, Danny, absolutely, I think.
Thank you.
Normalization.
Manu, I'm just going to share a little thought, but thank you very much for your talk. It's just great, and there's so much. I look forward to reading it. But when we were talking about midwives, I guess something was coming to me. My daughter's expecting a baby this week, and she's been told that unless she has the baby by Sunday, they will induce her. And I'm just thinking about this whole process as something that's coming along. But the idea of, you know, a lot of talk about therapists as midwives and clients, but very little talk about baby. And I'm just wondering if there's something almost like with the artist and the viewer, there's also the work of art itself. It's something that emerges, it's what emerges, but it's not either of those. It's not the painter or the viewer, and it's not necessarily co-created. It's actually something of itself, which might be a little bit like the phenomena that you're talking about.
Absolutely. It's not about the co-creation. It's not about me and you. In a way, I mean, this is even difficult to say. You and I don't matter. What matters is the work of the experience, you can call it the work of art, is this movement of psyche, of, I don't know what to call it. A psyche, you know, in Heraclitus is, you cannot put limits to it. It's not my psyche, it's not yours. And also midwife, I dislike that view because it reminds me of Socrates, and I have a real beef with Socrates. I have a real beef with this coercion to speak, you know, and this pretense that, you know, I'm going to give birth to the truth that I already know. Such a presumptuous get. And I think it has, the implications are similar for therapy, that we are there. When I talk to my colleague, you know, the unveiling of truth. What? Veiling of truth? There is no such thing. There's only two people meeting and something being emerging, like you were saying. And so I'm sorry if I'm going overboard, perhaps, but I think it's something you said, something else, the art itself, the matter at hand. Yeah. Am I answering you?
Yes, thank you.
Well, Manu, first, I hope all goes well with the cancer treatment.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel.
So I'm very interested in what you said about art, but also about what you didn't say about art. I'm very interested in you saying that ABBA is not art. You know, and that makes me think that this notion of art as tied very closely to aesthetics excludes a lot of what happened in art in the 20th century. You know, Marcel Duchamp and his ready-mades, for instance, that are just things like a chair or a bicycle wheel. You know, they don't claim to have any aesthetic value. And a lot of what we recognize today as art is based on that. You know, not to mention, let's say, conceptual art and performance art. So that kind of bothers me because it really considers art through maybe a romantic perspective, which was the Hegelian, but before the Romantic period, art also didn't have anything to do with aesthetics. It was a spiritual vehicle, like, the Byzantine icons or, Andrei Rublev, these were works. So I think there is an issue there with kind of sliding quite closely to Hegel's lectures on aesthetics, and Adorno. I don't know. It just feels a bit stale. This Adorno. I think Abba taught me about jouissance more than Adorno.
About
Jouissance.
okay.
More than Adorno. And I include aesthetic theory in that as well.
I think it's a valid point. And when I brought Abba, I sort of exposed my preferences. And I do have a lot of time for Duchamp, particularly for the Duchamp who became a chess player eventually. I don't know though whether, for the Duchamp who was cross-dressing and looked like, c'est la vie, right? The name c'est la vie. Urinal, the best urinal, some people say is an image of Buddha upside down. I have less time though for the formulaic conceptual art, and I'm going to sound really old fuddy-duddy here, that I see nowadays in galleries. It touches me a lot less. But I confess that I always run the risk to go close to this romantic view, because I think perhaps the origin, 19th century, subject gets magnified, and then the subject starts to fall apart. It's something that's part of my European, it's almost on my skin, it's very hard to shed. But I also tell you the genealogy of this particular presentation was my conversation with the late Richard Pierce, literally weeks before he died, and his fury and enthusiasm at how existential phenomenology had ignored the Franco school. So that was the original, was an attempt to continue the conversation. And of course, it has its limitations. I agree. And as for Abba, I don't know.
Can I just say, you need to watch Muriel's Wedding.
What's that?
I think that something's coming to my mind. ABBA, there's a film called Muriel's Wedding.
Yes, I know.
And I think it says something about how something can emerge. It's not the vehicle. It's something indefinable. Something can come out of anything. I think, if you've not seen Muriel's Wedding, it will explain.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I like dancing, I guess I could dance to ABBA easily. I danced to lots of strange pop songs, particularly in the dark ages of the 1980s. It was absolutely, musically, it was absolute stuff, except perhaps Soft Cell and a few other groups. What am I saying? I'm saying perhaps my view is a little bit elitist. I like to think that art has to disturb, stimulate, make you want to go to the street and erect barricades or question your life. And of course, on a Saturday night, put a record on and I'll go for any tune. But I think art is influential. And anyway, yeah, I'm aware of a particular preference, and you should remember, I was completely brought up and entrenched and by the Velvet Underground. So how on earth am I going to like AMP? It's personal preference.
I have a question, Manu.
Okay.
So you talked about a few times previously about mommy daddy concept and this approach that it's limiting. So I want to understand what you mean by that, what annoys you about that, and what's beyond that. What do you suggest as an alternative?
Okay, so the inspiration that comes from Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, two a psychiatrist and a philosopher, respectively philosopher and psychiatrist, who said the unconscious is not a static theater where everything that happens has to go back to Oedipus, has to go back to mom and dad. The unconscious is more like a factory, a feverish factory, and they took a clue from a theater writer, genius, Antonin Artaud. So the unconscious, you could say, if we widen it, the psyche, the experience is, it cannot go always under the overarching mom and dad Oedipus. That's one interesting myth, one interesting formula, but there are hundreds more, and we create them as we speak, as we dream. So that's the idea. And there are many, many examples. I think you were there at the session when we did the rhizome, working with dreams and then the rhizome. So as a group, dreaming.
Yeah.
So there is more about truly associative work, which moves away from those fixed formula. So that's the general idea, and it's an attempt at an experiment. You know, does everything has to do with Oedipus and mom and dad? I think not. It has to do with so many other things, including the craziness of the world, the political situation, the very real presence of others who are not stand-in or extras for mom and dad. You are real. No matter how much you might remind me of my mom, but you are real. And I have to deal with that reality in a real context. Etc. That's the general idea. Then how we do it, it's another story.
Yeah. Okay, makes sense. Thank you.
Glad it does. Thank you.
Manu, I'm struck by a couple of things in your talk.
Mm-hmm.
One was when you brought in immanence, and the second when you brought in world feeling. It strikes me that feeling is an aspect of our immanence, because that's how we apprehend the world. So there's an aspect of your talk which is, what is it to be alive? Rather than what is it to conform? And it's interesting because you're actually setting up two potential universes. There's the universe of feeling, and contrary-wise, there's the universe of geometry and mathematics, which is beloved of the Greeks. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
I think that's a spot on, and I haven't really thought about it, but perhaps world feeling, perhaps close to affect.
Yep.
And affect understood as with affect theory is something that is pre-individual. So I look, okay, let me try to put it in Adorno's terms if I can remember. I look at a painting and I'm aware of the affect of the painting. And importantly, I'm aware of the contradiction within it. There is the harmony, there is the beauty, and there is also the fucked upness, the unresolved, the erotic society and the world coming in there. And I absorb that. So, no, if I understand correctly your comment, it's not feeling as in my feeling, you know, my subjective feeling about this. It's more an affect.
Yeah.
And this is a big, big field. And I am shocked that the psychotherapeutic world, with some exceptions, hasn't become aware of affect theory. For those of you who are interested, this comes the advert. Come to the one-year course, which I will start in September, online, in person in Waterloo. But if not, look up affect theory. You look up at the work of Brian Massumi, or, for example, Erin Manning, the work she does with neurodiversity and so on. So I suspect it has to do with that. And I hope I'm not straying too far off your excellent point.
No, my take on affect probably is to some extent, I can't say rooted in, because I'm not intelligent enough to be rooted in anything. But my take on it comes from Michel Henry, who really came up with a completely different version of what phenomenology is about from the inside out, rather than considering it as phenomenology as phenomenology of representation.
I don't know his work, but it sounds very intriguing. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so thank you for that. And interestingly, your remark just now actually alluded to why you disliked ABBA.
Alluded to what?
It alluded to why you disliked ABBA, because there wasn't the dissonance. And
Indeed, indeed.
We don't have an all fucked up version of ABBA, put it that way.
Indeed. And again, I think Daniel's point is really valid. I mean, I don't want to impose a preference, but I want to put myself in the picture and say, okay, this is how I say, this is what I like. And yeah, anyway.
Thank you.
Give you an example of the absence of that is oh dear, the name escapes me now, but he, very famous, very great painter who recently drifted into iPad art. Do you know what I'm talking? Hockney. Okay. It doesn't give me any world feeling. The iPad art, this beautified Yorkshire country, it's pretty, it's nice. All the primary colors, it's very soothing. So what? But again, it doesn't do anything for me. But maybe it does something for you. Maybe there's something I don't see in there. And I think what Adorno is trying to describe is harmony and disharmony, the world as it is, because it's not always so, not always in primary color. It's not always so soothing, beautified. And we're not doing this work in order to redeem people into some kind of deluded form of harmony. or gnosis, or so-called mental health, whatever that is, and so forth. Apology to any.
Are you saying that you don't feel anything when you look at Hockney's paintings?
Not the iPad thing. I used to like his early work for sure.
I'm just wondering, as we're coming to a close, what do you think of the idea that, well, I think it was Laplanche who said that, psychotherapy is should be essentially subversive. I'm just looking at your word of subversive. But it's a question of what one means by essential and what one means by subversive. And other forces always stop that radicalization. So modernism is brilliant at stopping anything really radical. Yeah. And so there's a way in which, how do we keep open our own notions of essential and subversive without us incorporating them into our own totalizing stuff?
Very, very difficult task. It's an excellent point. And Laplanche is, my goodness, it's been a great, great revelation. I really invite people to go and read his work. For me, in the project of the book, it was to retrieve discarded subversive ideas that are present and been forgotten in the psychotherapeutic, psychoanalytic tradition. For example, Freud's general theory of seduction it's a very subversive idea. But does anybody have the courage to even mention or understand it in Laplanche's terms? And the other object of subversion is to tear down those sacred cow, the banal way in which attachment theory is understood. I just give you some. How to then keep it without fossilizing into a new form? That's a good question. But obviously, the existence of SAFPAC testifies that it is possible to have these conversations. That is not all PowerPoint claptrap in some college or so-called university. We have to exercise the optimism of the will as much as we are pessimists in our intellect. And we have to be pessimists because, my goodness, look at the state of things. But the thing that for this exists, that we can have this conversation, it gives me hope. And but I guess we have to help each other, to not become fossils, I guess. I think we need community for that.
Hopefully we can look at experience of meaning without being trapped in 1950s existentialism and worldviews of it organizationally and theoretically and what have you.
Spot on, indeed. My goodness.
Manu, can we all thank Manu very much? Thanks,
thank you.
Go ahead.
No, thank you for your appreciation. Thank you for making time for this. Really.
Well, thank you for making time for us. Very much appreciate it. Very much looking forward to your talk next year. And just to say, this is the last seminar in our SAFPAC series for this academic year. We'll be starting again next year. Normally they're the first Thursday of the month. Very much welcome to come to those. This talk will also, Manu's agreed for it to be on our YouTube channel. So if you want to have a think, I think there's a lot to think about that's been spoken about this evening. Do feel free to come into our YouTube channel. We also, our next event actually is a conference. We have a conference on the 30th, the last Saturday of September, the 30th of September, where we're looking at technology and psychotherapy, looking at technology in terms of theory as technology, but also looking at it in terms of the internet and all these bots and goodness knows what's. Yeah? So have a good summer. We're not going to see you before, and hope we can catch up with people in the new academic year. Many thanks for attending. We're having a break now. For those on the programme, we'll reconvene at 8 o'clock. Thanks again, Manu. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.